The morning sun cast long shadows across Pearl Harbor as Admiral Chester William Nimitz stood on the bridge of his flagship, studying intelligence reports that would change the course of the Pacific War. It was May 28, 1942, and the Japanese Empire's momentum seemed unstoppable. 6 months had passed since their devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, and their forces had swept across the Pacific like a crimson tide, conquering the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and threatening Australia itself. Commander Joseph John Rochefort, the brilliant cryptanalyst who had been working tirelessly in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters, had just delivered news that sent shockwaves through the American Pacific Command. His team had cracked the Japanese naval code JN-25, revealing Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's ambitious plan to capture Midway Atoll and draw the remaining American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle that would secure Japanese dominance in the Pacific Ocean. The intelligence indicated that Yamamoto was assembling the largest naval force in history for this operation. 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, would spearhead the assault under the command of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the same man who had led the Pearl Harbor attack. Supporting this massive carrier strike force were battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and transport vessels carrying thousands of troops. The Japanese plan was elegant in its simplicity. Capture Midway, establish an advanced base closer to Hawaii, and force the American fleet into a battle where Japan's superior numbers would ensure victory. According to declassified Navy Department records from the National Archives, the intelligence breakthrough represented one of the most significant cryptographic achievements of World War II. What Yamamoto didn't know was that his carefully guarded secret was no longer secret at all. Nimitz realized this was both an unprecedented opportunity and a deadly trap. The Americans could prepare for the attack, but they would be facing overwhelming odds. The Pacific Fleet had only 3 operational aircraft carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, the latter still bearing battle damage from the recent Coral Sea engagement and theoretically requiring months of repairs. The weight of decision pressed heavily on Nimitz's shoulders as he contemplated the stakes. Failure would likely mean the loss of Hawaii and possibly force America to sue for peace in the Pacific. Success could turn the tide of the entire war. He made the fateful decision to commit everything he had to this battle, knowing that the survival of American naval power in the Pacific hung in the balance. As orders flew across the Pacific, American forces began mobilizing with desperate urgency. The damaged Yorktown was rushed into Pearl Harbor's dry dock, where teams of workers labored around the clock to make her battle-ready in just 3 days, a repair job that should have taken months. Every available aircraft was being prepared, every pilot briefed on what could be the most important mission of their lives. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, the Japanese combined fleet was already at sea, confident in their numerical superiority and the invincibility that had carried them to victory after victory across the Pacific. They were sailing toward what they believed would be their greatest triumph, unaware that they were heading into a carefully prepared ambush that would determine the fate of nations. The vast Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, as 2 mighty fleets converged on a tiny coral atoll that few Americans had heard of before 1942. Midway, consisting of just 2 small islands totaling less than 2.5 square miles, had become the focal point of what would be the largest naval battle in the Pacific War. Admiral Yamamoto's plan was characteristically bold and complex. The Japanese would simultaneously attack the Aleutian Islands in Alaska as a diversion, drawing American attention northward, while the main force struck Midway. After neutralizing the atoll's defenses, Japanese forces would establish a permanent base, extending their defensive perimeter and bringing them within striking distance of Hawaii. The plan required precise timing and coordination across thousands of miles of ocean. On the American side, Admiral Nimitz was orchestrating what amounted to a massive gamble with the future of American naval power. Task Force 16, commanded by Rear Admiral Raymond Ames Spruance, included the carriers Enterprise and Hornet. Task Force 17, under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, centered on the hastily repaired Yorktown. Together, these forces represented virtually everything America could muster in the Pacific. The Americans faced daunting odds. Intelligence estimates suggested the Japanese would bring over 160 ships to the battle, including 11 battleships, 8 aircraft carriers, and numerous cruisers and destroyers. Against this armada, the Americans could field only 25 ships, including their 3 precious aircraft carriers. The mathematics of warfare seemed to favor Japan decisively, but numbers alone wouldn't determine the outcome of this battle. The Americans possessed something equally valuable: foreknowledge of their enemy's intentions. While Japanese forces approached Midway expecting surprise, American commanders knew exactly when and where the attack would come. This intelligence advantage would prove crucial in the hours ahead. As June 4th dawned, tension filled the air above both fleets. Japanese pilots began launching from their carriers at 0430 hours, confident they would catch Midway's defenders completely unprepared. The strike force of 108 aircraft, including dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters, headed toward the atoll under the command of Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga. Contemporary reports from Time magazine described the approaching battle as potentially decisive for the entire Pacific campaign. Meanwhile, American reconnaissance planes had already spotted the incoming Japanese fleet. At 0534 hours, a PBY Catalina flying boat piloted by Ensign Jack Reed radioed the message that electrified American forces. Many planes heading Midway, bearing 320, distance 150. The battle everyone had been preparing for was finally beginning. On Midway itself, Marine and Navy defenders scrambled to their positions. The atoll's 28 aircraft, a mixture of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes, took off to intercept the incoming Japanese strike. These brave aviators knew they were outnumbered more than 3-1, but they also knew that every Japanese plane they could destroy or delay might make the difference in the larger battle to come. As the first Japanese bombs began falling, on Midway at 0620 hours, the stage was set for a confrontation that would determine whether Japan would achieve the decisive victory Yamamoto sought, or whether America would somehow turn the tables on their seemingly invincible enemy. The fate of the Pacific War hung in the balance as explosions erupted across the tiny atoll, marking the beginning of 4 days that would change the course of history. The thunderous roar of aircraft engines filled the morning sky as Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led his strike force toward Midway Atoll. At 0620 hours on June 4th, 1942, the first Japanese bombs exploded across the tiny island's airstrips and installations. The attack had begun exactly as Admiral Yamamoto had planned, but events were already beginning to spiral beyond anyone's control. Marine Captain Marion Eugene Carl and his fellow fighter pilots had taken off from Midway's airstrip in their obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters, determined to intercept the incoming Japanese formation despite being hopelessly outnumbered and outclassed. The ensuing air battle was savage and one-sided. The Japanese Zero fighters, piloted by veterans of countless Pacific battles, cut through the American defensive screen with deadly efficiency. Of the 26 American fighters that rose to meet them, only 2 would return to Midway unscathed. While the aerial battle raged overhead, Lieutenant Tominaga's bombers pummeled Midway's facilities. Hangar 6 erupted in flames, fuel storage. Tanks exploded in towering columns of black smoke, and the power plant was reduced to rubble. Yet despite the ferocity of the attack, Midway's airstrip remained operational, a crucial oversight that would have far-reaching consequences. As Tominaga surveyed the damage from his cockpit, he realized that a second strike would be necessary to completely neutralize Midway's defenses. At 0700 hours, he radioed back to the Japanese fleet. There is need for a second attack wave. This message would prove to be one of the most fateful communications of the entire Pacific War. Aboard the Japanese flagship Akagi, at 07:15 hours, Nagumo made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He ordered his air crews to rearm their aircraft, attacking the American fleet when it inevitably appeared. Across the four Japanese carriers, request for another strike on Midway meant reorganizing his air specialists, switching from armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes designed for naval warfare to high-explosive Admiral Nagumo believed for land targets, since no American fleet had yet been spotted. Naval. Meanwhile, the first American counterattack was already a crucial turning point from Midway's battered airstrip planning. Every aircraft that could still fly was being launched against the Japanese fleet. Captain James Fleming Collins led 16 Marine dive bombers toward the enemy carriers, followed by torpedo bombers and Army Air Force flying fortresses. These brave aviators knew they were flying toward almost certain death, but they also knew that every minute they could delay the Japanese might give the American carrier fleet a chance to strike. The American attacks began hitting the Japanese fleet at 0800 hours. Despite facing overwhelming defensive fire from Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft guns, the attackers pressed home their assaults with desperate courage. Major Lofton Russell Henderson led his squadron of dive bombers in a screaming dive toward the carrier Hiryu, even as Japanese Zeros tore into his formation. Henderson's aircraft was hit and burst into flames, but he held his dive until the last possible moment before his plane disintegrated in a ball of fire. Though these heroic attacks achieved few direct hits on the Japanese carriers, they accomplished something far more valuable. They kept Japanese fighters busy shooting them down instead of providing cover for their own fleet. More importantly, they forced Admiral Nagumo to delay his planned attack on the American carriers while dealing with these persistent raids from Midway. As the morning wore on, the scattered American attacks continued. Each wave was shot down with heavy losses, but each also bought precious time for the main American striking force, still approaching from the northeast under radio silence. The stage was being set for the most decisive naval engagement in Pacific War history, though neither side yet realized just how dramatically the tide of battle was about to turn. At 0800 hours on June 4, 1942, the vast Pacific Ocean became a theater of mounting tension as American and Japanese forces maneuvered for what would become the decisive moment of the Battle of Midway. Aboard the carrier Enterprise, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey prepared to lead his dive-bombing squadron into what he knew could be the most important mission of his life. The Japanese fleet under Admiral Nagumo had been under sporadic attack from Midway-based aircraft for over an hour, but the real threat was approaching from the northeast in the form of Task Forces 16 and 17. Admiral Fletcher, commanding from the Yorktown, had made the crucial decision to launch his strike at 0600 hours, even though the Japanese fleet's exact position remained uncertain. This bold move would prove instrumental in catching the enemy at their most vulnerable moment. Commander John Charles Waldron, leading Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, was the first to locate the Japanese fleet. Flying the notoriously slow and vulnerable Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers, Waldron knew his chances of survival were minimal. At 0920 hours, he radioed his final message: "Attack immediately. I am going in." What followed was one of the most heroic and tragic episodes in naval aviation history. Torpedo Squadron 8 pressed their attack against the Japanese carrier formation without fighter escort, having become separated from their protective screen during the long flight to the target. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, consisting of experienced Zero fighter pilots, fell upon the slow-moving American torpedo bombers with deadly efficiency. One by one, Waldron's aircraft were shot down into the churning Pacific waters. Only Ensign George Holden Gay Jr. survived, floating in the ocean and witnessing the carnage that followed. Naval historians, as documented in Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive Pacific War Chronicles, consider this sacrifice crucial to the eventual American victory. The slaughter of the American torpedo squadrons continued as Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise and Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown met similar fates. Of the 41 torpedo bombers that attacked the Japanese fleet that morning, only 6 would return to their carriers. The Japanese defenders, having beaten off these attacks with apparent ease, began to believe they had weathered the worst of the American assault. But the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons had achieved something beyond their crew's wildest hopes. By attacking at low altitude, they had drawn the entire Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, leaving the skies above the carriers virtually undefended. At precisely 10:24 hours, as Admiral Nagumo's crews were still frantically rearming and refueling aircraft on their carrier decks, Lieutenant Commander McCluskey's dive bombers appeared high overhead like avenging angels. The next 6 minutes would determine the outcome of the Pacific War. McCluskey's 37 dive bombers from Enterprise split into 2 groups, with one section targeting the carrier Kaga and the other attacking Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Franklin Leslie's dive bombers from Yorktown began their attack on Soryu. The Japanese carriers, caught with their decks loaded with armed and fueled aircraft, were sitting ducks. Lieutenant Richard Halsey Best, leading the attack on Akagi, pushed his dive bomber into a nearly vertical dive from 14,000 feet. His 1,000-pound bomb struck the carrier amidships, penetrating the flight deck and exploding among the armed aircraft. Below, the resulting fires and secondary explosions turned the pride of the Japanese fleet into a floating inferno within minutes. Simultaneously, Kaga was struck by multiple bombs that ignited massive fires among the aircraft and ordnance scattered across her deck. The carrier Soryu, hit by bombs from Yorktown's dive bombers, suffered a similar fate as explosions tore through her hangar decks. Within 6 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 premier aircraft carriers were burning wrecks, their experienced air crews dead or dying in the flames. Admiral Nagumo, forced to transfer his flag from the burning Akagi to the light cruiser Nagara, watched in horror as the backbone of Japanese naval aviation was destroyed before his eyes. The carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor, conquered the Dutch East Indies, and dominated the Pacific for 6 months were now blazing pyres on the blue waters of the Pacific, marking the moment when Japan's offensive capability was broken forever. The burning hulks of 3 Japanese aircraft carriers cast pillars of black smoke into the Pacific sky as the 4th carrier, Hiryu, desperately maneuvered to avoid the fate of her sister ships. Captain Tomeo Kaku, commanding Hiryu, knew that his vessel now carried the hopes of the entire Japanese fleet. At 1100 hours on June 4, 1942, he ordered an immediate counterattack against the American carriers, launching every aircraft he could muster. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters from Hiryu toward the American fleet, determined to exact revenge for the devastating losses his comrades had suffered. The Japanese pilots, veterans of Pearl Harbor and numerous Pacific battles, flew with grim determination, knowing that the outcome of the entire campaign now rested on their shoulders. At 12:10 hours, Kobayashi's strike force found their target, the carrier Yorktown, flagship of Rear Admiral Fletcher's Task Force 17. The American carrier, having just recovered her returning dive bombers, was caught in a vulnerable moment. Despite fierce defensive fire from the ship's anti-aircraft guns and her escorting destroyers, the Japanese pilots pressed home their attack with suicidal courage. 3 bombs struck Yorktown in rapid succession, causing massive damage to her flight deck and starting serious fires below. The explosions knocked out several boiler rooms, bringing the 20,000-ton carrier to a dead stop in the water. Damage control parties worked frantically to restore power and fight the blazes, while her escorting vessels formed a protective screen around the wounded giant. But Captain Elliot Buckmaster and his crew were not finished fighting. Through superhuman efforts, Yorktown's damage control teams managed to restore power and get the carrier moving again at 20 knots within 2 hours. The flight deck was patched, fires were extinguished, and aircraft were being spotted for launch when the second Japanese strike arrived. Contemporary accounts from Navy Department action reports detail the extraordinary resilience shown by Yorktown's crew during these critical hours. At 2:45 hours, Lieutenant Toshio Hashimoto led 10 torpedo bombers from Hiryu in a low-level attack against the seemingly crippled American carrier. Despite the earlier damage, Yorktown's guns were still firing, and her combat air patrol fought desperately to intercept the incoming torpedoes. But 2 Japanese torpedoes found their mark, striking the carrier's port side and causing severe flooding. This second attack proved too much for the valiant ship. Yorktown began listing heavily to port, and Captain Buckmaster reluctantly gave the order to abandon ship at 300 hours. The crew's evacuation was conducted with remarkable discipline, with destroyers moving alongside to take off survivors while the carrier continued to list dangerously. However, the loss of Yorktown did not signal American defeat. Quite the opposite. While Hiryu's pilots were celebrating what they believed to be a decisive victory, American forces were preparing their own revenge. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, the hero of the morning attack, was already leading a fresh strike from Enterprise toward the last operational Japanese carrier. At 1700 hours, 24 dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown, the latter having been diverted from their sinking carrier, found Hiryu steaming alone on the vast Pacific. The Japanese carrier's fate was sealed within minutes as American bombs tore through her flight deck and ignited fires among the aircraft below. Captain Kaku chose to go down with his ship, and by the evening of June 4th, all 4 of Admiral Nagumo's fleet carriers were either sunk or burning hulks. The scale of Japanese losses was staggering. In addition to 4 irreplaceable aircraft carriers, Japan had lost over 300 experienced pilots and air crew, the trained professionals who had formed the backbone of their naval aviation. These losses could not be replaced quickly, if at all. Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring the battle from his flagship Yamato hundreds of miles away, realized that his grand strategy had collapsed. At 02:55 hours on June 5th, he issued the order that confirmed Japan's defeat. Occupation of Midway is canceled. As the sun set on June 4th, 1942, the balance of power in the Pacific had shifted permanently. The Japanese tide that had seemed unstoppable just 24 hours earlier was now in full retreat, marking the beginning of the long road that would eventually lead to Tokyo Bay. The dawn of June 5th, 1942, revealed a Pacific Ocean transformed by the previous day's carnage. Where once 4 proud Japanese aircraft carriers had ruled the waves, only burning wrecks and oil slicks remained. The Battle of Midway had reached its climax, but the final act was yet to be written as Admiral Yamamoto struggled to salvage something from the disaster that had befallen his combined fleet. From his flagship Yamato, positioned with the main battleship force 300 miles northwest of the action, Yamamoto faced the most difficult decision of his naval career. His carriers were gone, his air power decimated, and the element of surprise completely lost. Yet he still commanded the most powerful surface fleet in the world, including the massive Yamato herself, armed with 18-inch guns that could destroy any American ship from 20 miles away. For several agonizing hours, Yamamoto considered pressing forward with a night surface attack, using his battleships and cruisers to bombard Midway and force a decisive engagement with the American fleet. His staff officers urged him to continue the battle, arguing that Japanese gunnery superiority could still win the day. But the admiral, understanding better than anyone the strategic implications of losing his entire carrier force, made the painful decision to withdraw. At 02:55 hours on June 5th, Yamamoto's radio message reached every ship in the combined fleet. Occupation of Midway is canceled. All forces will withdraw to the northwest. The greatest naval offensive in Japanese history was over, ending not in the glorious victory that had been anticipated, but in crushing defeat. Meanwhile, American forces were dealing with their own tragedy. The carrier Yorktown, abandoned but still afloat, had become a symbol of American resilience. Captain Buckmaster had returned to his ship with a salvage crew, and there seemed hope that the veteran carrier might be saved. Working parties had managed to reduce the list and were preparing to take the ship under tow when disaster struck again. According to official Navy records archived at the Naval Historical Center, the final loss of Yorktown demonstrated both American determination and the persistent threat of Japanese submarines. At dawn on June 6th, the Japanese submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, penetrated the destroyer screen around the crippled carrier. Despite the vigilant patrol maintained by American escorts, Tanabe managed to fire 4 torpedoes. At point-blank range, 2 struck Yorktown, and a third hit the destroyer Hammond, which was tied alongside providing power and pumping facilities. The explosion aboard Hammond was catastrophic, breaking the destroyer's back and killing 81 of her crew instantly. The renewed damage to Yorktown proved fatal, and at 0500 hours on June 7th, the gallant carrier rolled over and sank, taking with her the memories of countless battles from the Coral Sea to her final stand at Midway. Yet even, this loss could not diminish the magnitude of American victory. In 4 days of fighting, the United States Navy had accomplished what many thought impossible. They had stopped the seemingly invincible Japanese advance and inflicted irreplaceable losses on their enemy's most elite forces. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, over 250 aircraft, and approximately 3,000 experienced personnel, including many of their finest pilots. American losses, while painful, were far more manageable. 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 150 aircraft, and 307 personnel killed represented a tiny fraction of Japanese casualties. More importantly, the American industrial capacity could replace these losses within months, while Japan would never again achieve the superiority in trained pilots and modern carriers that they had possessed before Midway. The strategic consequences of the battle extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. Japan's ability to conduct major offensive operations in the Pacific was permanently crippled, while American morale soared with the knowledge that their enemy could be defeated. The myth of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated since Pearl Harbor, lay as shattered as the burning carriers on the floor of the Pacific Ocean. As the surviving ships of both fleets departed the waters around Midway, they left behind more than just the wreckage of a great naval battle. The Japanese dream of Pacific domination was sinking beneath the waves along with their carriers, while American confidence in eventual victory was rising like the sun over their triumphant fleet. The tide of war had turned permanently, and the long road to Tokyo could finally begin.